In recent years, a narrative has begun to emerge from the murkier parts of the internet, finding its way into mainstream news articles and the comment sections beneath just about any article or video discussing stealth aircraft. So I decided to get to the bottom of it, and what I found was surprising. Let's talk about the Horten Ho 229 and the legend of World War II era stealth. I'm Alex Hollings, and this is Air Power. Right off the bat, I want to apologize for being MIA last week. I was traveling and brought my whole setup with me to record and edit, but ran into a bunch of technical issues that just made posting a video impossible. I promise I'll make it up to you guys by adding some extra content in the weeks to come. But just in case you're jonesing for more of me ranting about airplanes, swing by the Team House YouTube channel. Earlier this week, I hopped on live with Special Operations veterans Jack Murphy and David Park while they interviewed me for 2 hours about everything from the V-280 Valor to me struggling to find a simple way to explain the difference between the turbo ramjet J-58 that powered the SR-71 and more modern combined cycle ramjet and scramjet engines in development with firms like Hermeus. Jack Murphy is not just a former Army Ranger and Green Beret, he's also the guy who gave me my first big break in journalism. So, I highly recommend their channel, but I do want to warn you, it's an adult show, so there's a little bit of strong language in the interview. But now, let's get down to business, because despite what you may have seen in comment sections around the internet, or even on some pretty prominent news outlets, the Germans did not invent stealth aircraft before the end of World War II. And while I can say that unequivocally, what did surprise me is how this myth became so prevalent in recent years. You guys know me by now, so I have no qualms with telling you that I started researching this topic sort of out of spite. At first, I thought a lot of the people saying that Germany actually invented stealth and the US acquired it through Operation Paperclip were just saying that because they were big fans of World War II Germany. But as I looked a bit deeper, I found that there are actually some legitimate reasons for so many people to have this misconception. Though those reasons aren't based in historical fact, but rather a popular narrative that first emerged in the 80s and took hold due to the irresponsible nature of a number of large-scale media organizations. A big part of this myth, there's no denying, comes from the lackluster reporting of a lot of different news and history outlets that were eager to capitalize on clickbaity titles or headlines about German superweapons. These stories paint World War II Germany as this terrifying technological juggernaut that was always just on the verge of a new breakthrough that would turn the tide of the war and leave us all saluting the Führer before bed each night. Within aviation circles, the biggest myth is this idea that Germany invented stealth. And this myth all stems from the work of Walter and Reimer Horten. The Horten brothers began experimenting with unusual airframe designs before the outbreak of World War II, but they got their big break in 1943 when the head of the Luftwaffe, Hermann Göring, called for a new light bomber design that could carry 1,000 kilograms of munitions 1,000 kilometers per hour to targets 1,000 kilometers away. For those of us in the US, that's 2,200 pounds of ordnance at 620 miles per hour to targets 620 miles away. The Horten brothers recognized that achieving those speeds with such a heavy payload would require using the recently developed turbojet engine. But these high-powered engines came with a big drawback. They were fuel-hungry and inefficient. The British had made significant leaps in radar technology during World War II, but the Horten brothers' flying wing design wasn't born out of any interest or even awareness that such a design could help delay detection. Instead, they chose it because it was aerodynamically efficient. With no tail surfaces to produce drag and a streamlined flying wing body, their Horten H9 design was all about reducing the fuel requirements for long-duration, high-speed flight. And while their design really would become the first jet-powered flying wings themselves had already been around for a long time. The earliest tailless flying wing design may be credited to France's Alphonse Pinot, I'm sure I mispronounced that, back in 1871. But the first real powered flying wing was actually a biplane called the D-4, which was developed by a British Army officer named John Williams Doone in 1908. The Hortens proposal was the only one submitted to the German government that even came close to their requested requirements, and they immediately set about building an unpowered glider to demonstrate their design. Following a successful flight of the glider, they moved on to building the H-9 V2, often now referred to as the Ho 229 V2, which was the same design but with the addition of two Junkers Jumo 004 turbojet engines. But that's about as far as this story goes. In February of 1945, the V2 crashed, killing its test pilot. And although the German government ordered 100 of these jets to be called the Ho 229, the war ended before the third prototype, often called the 229 V3, was even finished. With the war over, more than 1,600 scientists and engineers working for the German government were recruited to work for the US under Operation Paperclip, and more than 2,500 more were brought to the Soviet Union in their own similar efforts. These specialists continued to work on a variety of new programs for each nation in the years that followed, and can often be found named under prominent programs like NASA's Apollo missions. The truth is, the Horten brothers were not blessed with advanced or otherworldly knowledge, and that fact becomes apparent when you consider their post-war careers. Reimer Horten first attempted to negotiate with both the UK and China for an opportunity to continue developing his flying wings. But after neither expressed any interest, he settled on emigrating to Argentina. And this is the first place in my research where it became overtly clear that the narrative surrounding the Horten brothers and stealth was doing more of the heavy lifting in this tale than their actual engineering work ever did. Somehow, according to countless outlets, Reimer Horten was brilliant enough to develop the first stealth aircraft decades before anyone else. But he was also not smart enough to realize that Argentina wouldn't be able to offer him the same level of resources a newly emerging global superpower could. But even when people are willing to address that point directly, they still bloviate wistfully about what could have been. I'm not kidding. I'll quote Russell E. Lee, curator in the Aeronautics Department of the National Air and Space Museum, from an interview he did with Smithsonian Magazine. Reimer had fallen on hard times in the 1950s. At that time, Argentina did not have the aeronautical resources of the United States. I don't think he realized that until after he got there. If things had gone differently, who knows what he could have accomplished. Now, I'm definitely not saying that we should just never credit German scientists or engineers for breakthroughs made during this era. And I do understand that Lee doing that interview was promoting their display of the Ho 229 V3 prototype that they have in the museum. But this is a strangely doting way to talk about the bad guys in World War II just to sell some tickets. Now, Reimer's continued work would eventually lead to another flying wing, the notably not stealth FMA IAE-38, which was supposedly based directly on that Ho 229 V3 prototype that was never finished. Now, you'd probably expect that an aircraft based on this platform that birthed so many legends would have been a resounding success. After all, he had 2 more decades to refine his design. But instead, it only made one successful flight before being totally canceled in 1960. Walter Horten gave up on pursuing aircraft design altogether and stayed in Germany to serve in the nation's post-war Air Force. If these two enterprising young men really had unlocked the secrets to stealth way back then, nations would have been clamoring for their expertise, and today their names would be as recognizable as other German scientists and engineers that found new homes in other nations. People like Werner von Braun. But we can't talk about how the Ho 229 is conflated as stealth without talking about Jack Northrop. Now, in case you're not familiar, Jack Northrop was the famed founder of the defense industry giant known today as Northrop Grumman. And he did express his interest in the gliders being developed by the Horten brothers in the 1930s. He and his firm would go on to develop a variety of flying wing designs for the US military, in a lineage that would culminate with the B-2 Spirit and today's B-21 Raider. For those eager to give the Horten brothers and World War II Germany credit for the development of stealth, this is one of those elements they often point to. But attributing Northrop's flying wing successes to the Horten brothers' failure requires omitting a fair bit of important context. Jack Northrop was born in 1895 and began experimenting with flying wings in 1929 with his first company after leaving Lockheed called Avion. Though his first, quote, flying wing actually had a pretty prominent tail section attached via two booms. Walter and Reimer Horten, born in 1913 and 1915 respectively, began their own experiments with flying wing gliders in 1933. In 1940, Northrop fielded his first real flying wing, the N1M, which stood for Northrop First Mock-Up. The aircraft even performed well enough in testing that it prompted the Air Force to request a design proposal from Northrop for their new bomber program. His resulting design was the XB-35, which the Air Force agreed to help develop in November of 1941, 3 years before the Horten brothers began their own work on what would become the Ho 229. In fact, the Hortens' first powered flying wing, the H-8, made its first flight in 1944. But to be fair, the XB-35 design was prop-driven, and the Ho 229 was jet-powered, making it a more advanced approach. And to be clear, the Ho 229 V2 did take flight more than 3 years before Northrop's first jet-powered flying wing, the YB-49. And by that point, Northrop's team did have access to the wreckage of the Horten brothers' prototypes, though Northrop himself didn't seem to think much of them. I'll quote him here. "Forget it. They're just glider designers." Of course, that's not to say that the Northrop team didn't glean anything from the Hortens' work. It's safe to say neither he nor his team would be eager to advertise any lessons learned from recovered German hardware. And as is always the case in aviation, advances made by one nation often inform the advances made by others. But it's not logical to credit Northrop's transition to jet-powered flying wings to the Hortens. The Air Force was pushing for jet-powered bombers at this time. So where did this idea that the Horten brothers invented stealth come from? Well, it turns out Reimer Horten was better at inventing myths than he was at inventing airplanes. He may not have been able to garner any real interest in his flying wings outside of Argentina, but that didn't stop him from making grandiose claims about what his design could have been throughout the remainder of his life. If anything, it was his claims in the early 80s that became the basis for this entire myth. It's important to understand that although the US didn't acknowledge that the F-117 was operational until 1988, and didn't give the world its first glimpse of a real stealth aircraft until 1989, stealth itself was a very open secret for years before that. During the 1980 presidential election, the Carter administration disclosed that there was a stealth plane in development to curb criticisms leveled by Reagan over the cancellation of the B-1 bomber. By 1982, America's, quote, secret stealth bomber was already a part of budget discussions in the New York Times. And by 1986, shows like the A-Team were referencing stealth bombers in their plot lines. So it comes as little surprise that in 1983, Reimer Horten took advantage of all this new stealth aircraft hype to reinvent the Horten Ho 229 as a stealth aircraft. According to Reimer's claims, he had always intended to combine sawdust, charcoal, and glue, and apply that between the layers of wood that made up most of the 229's external surfaces. I'll quote him here. "The charcoal should absorb the electrical waves under this shield, then under the tubular steel airframe, and the engines would be invisible to radar." Now, back in 1983, the idea that charcoal could absorb radar might have struck some people as feasible. But of course, today, we're well aware of the complex material science involved in producing polymer, or more modern ceramic, radar-absorbent materials. If mixing charcoal with sawdust could actually reduce an aircraft's radar return, maintaining the F-22 would be a heck of a lot cheaper. But nonetheless, a Northrop Grumman team did analyze the 229 V3 to look for any signs of this radar-defeating charcoal mixture, and they initially thought that they did indeed find some. So they used a portable radar reflectometer called the Next Generation Sensor to assess the return created by the leading edge of the 229's center section. And they found that it actually produced a greater radar return than their control sample, which was just a 3/4 inch piece of plywood. And to make matters even worse for Horton's claims, a subsequent analysis conducted by the National Air and Space Museum during the aircraft's restoration concluded via digital microscopy, X-ray diffraction, and something called a Fourier transfer spectroscopy test all showed that there was no actual charcoal in the glue at all. That was in keeping with recovered documents pertaining to the Ho 229's development that never mentioned anything about stealth or preventing radar detection or adding charcoal to glue or what have you. All of this suggests that the whole story was nothing more than a fabrication that was given much more credence than was ever warranted. But this would not be the last time, nor would it even be the highest profile time that Horton's claims would just be given way more credit than they ever deserved. Because easily, the biggest culprit in advancing the myth of German World War II stealth was National Geographic. In 2009, Nat Geo released a Northrop Grumman-sponsored film called Hitler's Stealth Fighter that went pretty far out of its way to portray the Ho 229 not only as the world's first real stealth aircraft, but potentially even one that could have helped the Germans win the war. In a commercial for the documentary you can find right here on YouTube, the narrator claims that the only surviving Horten 229 has remained hidden in the shadows and away from prying eyes, later claiming within the documentary that the aircraft was being stored in a secret government warehouse, right out of an Indiana Jones movie. The real truth is that it was stored outside in Chicago for a while before being moved to the Smithsonian's restoration facility in Maryland, which is hardly a secret, where the Ho 229 V3 sat and literally rotted for 60 years, even spending some of that time in a wide-open woodshed. For the sake of the documentary, Northrop Grumman invested $250,000 into building a replica of the Ho 229 V3. They then bombarded it with radar to assess just how stealthy it really was, and their analysis revealed, quote, moderate radar deflecting properties, which the documentary presented as undeniable proof that this stealth aircraft was the real deal. In fact, they said outright that their findings revealed, quote, just how close Nazi engineers were to unleashing a jet that some say could have changed the course of the war. Now, if you've ever watched an episode of Ancient Aliens, you're already familiar with the qualifier "some say" as a means to present utter nonsense as fact simply because some might say it. But what about Northrop Grumman's team's findings that the aircraft replica they assembled did offer, quote, moderate radar deflecting capabilities? Well, that also required a fair bit of creative liberty. As Stephen Wilkinson pointed out in his excellent write-up on the topic back in 2020, making the Horton Ho 229 that stealthy meant leaving out most of the things that could have made it a fighter, a bomber, or even an aircraft. The Horten brothers' original design included an 11-foot wide center section made of welded steel tubing that Northrop left out of their replica. The Ho 229 also had 2 early turbojet engines, which Northrop also left out of their replica. They also left out the Ho 229's 8 large aluminum fuel tanks, and maybe most importantly of all, the aircraft was always designed to carry munitions externally, which they also didn't include. In effect, they omitted all of the elements of this wooden aircraft that would have produced the most prominent radar returns, and then said that it was moderately stealthy as a result. Germany's Horten brothers really did develop the world's first jet-powered flying wing, and that alone earns them a place in discussions about the flying wings that would follow. But the idea that these two young men were engineering visionaries so far ahead of their time that we're still struggling to catch up is nothing more than the Hortons' own efforts to rewrite history, and the subsequent and sensationalized storytelling that leaned on their narrative for the sake of ratings, readers, or clicks. The fact of the matter is, boring truths never outsell sensationalized fiction, and I betcha this video itself won't do particularly well because it's just dispelling a common misconception misconception, and that's not all that sexy. In fact, if you made it this far into the video, let me know in the comments by saying anything at all about the F-14. People who don't watch the whole video won't know what you're talking about, but I will. The Ho 229 never even really existed, and instead manifested only as a dream of what could have been if the aircraft's one flying prototype had ever actually produced an operational aircraft. That prototype was admittedly groundbreaking, but that was in large part because by 1943, Germany was willing to throw money at anything that might help them win the war. This aircraft wasn't an exotic glimpse of the future. By most accounts, they were poorly assembled and riddled with design flaws. The Ho 229 V2 prototype that actually flew was nearly impossible to fly at first because Walter Horton determined its center of gravity using a measuring tape that was missing its first 10 centimeters, famously skewing the aircraft's balance so much that the test pilot said he could barely keep it airborne with the stick pulled all the way back. And even after fixing that issue, that same prototype would later crash, killing its test pilot. If World War II had never happened, the Horten brothers may have had promising careers as kit, airplane, and glider builders, but almost certainly not as the forefathers of stealth. The truth is, Jack Northrop did get a lot wrong in his comments about the Horten brothers over the years, but he hit the nail on the head about one thing. Forget it. They're just glider designers. And on that ends another edition of Air Power from Sandboxx News. I'm Alex Hollings. Make sure you swing by sandboxnews.com today and every day for all the latest in news, entertainment, and motivation from all around the force. If you got anything out of today's video, make sure to click like and subscribe down below and leave me a comment so I know what I should cover next. And don't forget to tap on that bell icon so you never miss a drop from Sandboxx News.